Hello everybody and welcome to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast powered by eBay Motors Group, joined by myself, Philip Nothard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson. This is episode 28, season 8 of Motor Trade Radio, bringing you all the chatter that matters. With the country celebrating the Platinum Jubilee Bank Holiday weekend, we're taking a break from our regular review of the car retailing headlines to bring you a special Motor Trade Radio interview with leading automotive analyst and friend of the podcast, Steve Young. Welcome back to the show, Steve.
Thanks, Curtis, and thanks, Philip. It's a pleasure to be back, though I'm not sure if it's perhaps a poison chalice to be competing with barbecues and street parties. But thanks for the invitation.
You might be a welcome break from it all by the time we get to Saturday morning, Steve.
Absolutely. We can only see.
There's the Thursday and Friday to get through first, and then Saturday probably might be enough. So we'll be all right. We'll be all right. So, yeah. I mean, welcome back, and obviously by the way of a quick background, Steve is the managing director of ICDP, the International Automotive Retail and After Sales Consultancy, and is former CEO of LDV Group. He'll be familiar with many listeners and for his unmissable weekly blogs posted on icdp.net and on Steve's LinkedIn page, which take a deep dive into the hot topics impacting the car retailing sector. We thought we'd take this opportunity to catch up with you to hear your take on some of these trends and with a focus on the used car sector agency model and anything else on the horizon impacting dealers and OEMs.
Now, to get the ball rolling, Steve, you're just back from a dealer conference in Verona, Automotive Dealer Days, which must have been a welcome return to face-to-face networking for you. So tell us about some of the conversations you were having with dealers who, after all, they've emerged from COVID straight into the challenges of new and used car shortages. So what was the mood? What were the conversations you were having there?
Well, I think the Dealer Days is sort of quite a unique event. I mean, it's almost totally focused on the Italian market. Very few international delegates, some international speakers, but few international delegates. And it's actually the second largest dealer event in the world. So lots of the listeners will be familiar with the NADA show in the US. That gets 20,000 plus. Well, they get 4,000 to 5,000 at the Dealer Days in Italy, and that's bigger than anything that I'm aware of in Brazil or China or anywhere else. So it's a big event, and we all know the Italians love interaction and socializing and so on. So they were all very pleased to be back face to face, and the mood was largely upbeat because of that. People just enjoyed being back face to face. The Italian approach to compulsory wearing of face masks in the convention center was shown usual disregard, and people were just sort of enjoying themselves being back in that community. I think the biggest concern that they had, and I know we'll talk about that a bit later on, but the biggest concern that they have is agency. But in general, they were talking about the Italian dealers specifically. Then they're suffering at the moment with the product shortages. Their business model does not tolerate the sort of flexibility that we've seen in the UK or Netherlands or a number of other markets, or in the US as well, for example. They make a lot of money normally from new cars. They can't get any. The ones that are available are electric cars, and Italy's right at the back of that sort of development curve in terms of infrastructure and customer acceptance of EVs. And their used car business is not as well developed as it is in the UK, and the customers seem to be less willing to pay more for a used car when there's a shortage. So they're hurting at the moment. You know, some are actually making losses, which will sound very strange to a UK dealer.
Yeah, I was interested in your blog where you were talking about a conversation you were having with some US dealers and the experience over there in terms of buying new cars and what that means to customers because they're in a position where they can actually auction the cars off to pretty much the highest bidders, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds quite strange to us, and I don't think it's actually in the interests of the US dealers in the long term, but some of them are actually um, waiting until they get a transporter load of cars and then calling up the people who registered interest and then literally auctioning them off to the interested parties. And so whether you go to that extreme or just put a markup on the list price when a customer inquires and there's a car available, the general habit seems to be that cars are being sold over list, and the manufacturers aren't happy with that. I don't think the customers will be happy with it over time, but they're managing to finance the cars still because the value of the trade-in is also high because they've got the same situation on used car
Yes. Yeah.
availability there. So the actual finance amount is pretty similar to what it's been in the past, and anyone that's familiar with the States will know that the finance is a fairly crazy mixed up situation with sort of 6-year loan terms and things like this.
And there's probably some listeners this morning thinking if only they could get hold of transporterfuls of new cars for them to auction off.
Yeah, I think they badly want the new car inventory, and it's just not available. The customer demand is there, but the stock isn't either for new or for used, and you see how that's also affecting the used car business with the sort of collapse of confidence in Carvana and um, even CarMax falling back from its historic profitability to something that's still strong but much more modest.
Yeah, and one last question on automotive dealers, Ace, because you covered this in your blog as well, that some of the dealers you were talking to and some of the observations you made were about dealers building up these strong cash reserves. And what was the sort of feel for what sort of feel have you got for what they're actually doing with these cash reserves? Because you did mention super yachts, supercars.
Yeah, I think the in Italy, the dealers are not generally building up cash reserves, and to the extent that they are, which tends to be the larger groups, then they're being quite cautious with that because, as I say, their business model is different to what we would see in the UK. But certainly, in Brazil, there's a Brazilian dealer representative there. We do some business in Brazil anyway. Then they're having a great time and building up cash, and they certainly are in the States. And we obviously know the numbers in the UK, and the in the US apparently, some of the dealers are going out and they're buying jets, and they're buying you know better jets than the one they had before. Which is, if you think about the States in terms of its overall geography, it makes some sense. But when you look at the structure of US dealers, then you do tend to be in fairly concentrated geographies. So they're going out and buying some toys.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, there's a lot going on. Like you say, there's a lot of change over in the States as there is anywhere else. And talking about that, I mean, a recent ICDP research program members meeting, one of the topics of conversation with the future of used car trends, which you encapsulated into a recent blog entitled 5 over 5, as in 5 key changes in the next 5 years. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to share some of the thoughts on for their listeners. And so tell us a bit about these 5 trends that you identified for the used car market.
Well, I think the first one was around the development of sort of regional leaders and local heroes at the same time. So we in general think that scale becomes more important because of digitalization in the main, but there's still significant differences across markets in Europe, and we touched on that just now talking about Italy, that say that the sort of pan-European, super business, the sort of thing that Kazoo were seemed to be targeting at launch, isn't real. But we will see businesses that respond well to the challenges and who embrace the different needs, and some of those will be regional. So that could be, in the case of the UK, it's UK. We're an island, so we can't export easily as you can in continental Europe. But in other parts, it might be a cluster of markets. So Benelux, for example, or southern Belgium, northern France. Which is there's some sort of significant players there. So we do think that there'll be some who pull ahead. Second one, what's talked about scale and digitalization, and that is an area where if you want to have that in-house, then you need to have some minimum scale for that to make sense. You need it to invest, you need it to attract the right people, you need it to have the volumes of data that allow you to inform your decisions. But there's also an emerging group of external providers who can provide you with that data to allow you to make the decision. So they, in aggregate, have got the scale and the volume of data to come up with the recommendations around pricing and stock mix and so on. And so the smaller players, the smallest players even, will still have the opportunity to buy into that if they want, and that's really what drives the local hero opportunity. I do think there are dealers who are asleep at the wheel, who don't recognize, how the industry is changing, and who will be left behind. So, whilst the leaders in whatever form start to get benefits from the better processes, improved information, and so on, the better service capabilities that they can buy in, those that don't do it will be underperforming to an even greater degree than they are today. So there'll be a wider gap. Consequence of people looking at the data and interpreting it rather than applying their many years of experience and judgment, I think will result in buying and selling prices being more harmonized. So the buying prices falling into a narrower window and the selling prices falling into a narrower window. And so the likely result of that is that the spread will be reduced, so margins will be squeezed. And then the final one, is around culture change, and that's sort of really quite an interesting question, because dealer groups in general, obviously the entrepreneurs are entrepreneurial, the smaller owner operators, but the dealer groups in general have tried to maintain that entrepreneurial culture. They still value that skill, and they generally have set up the KPIs and the reward mechanisms and so on to allow each individual site some degree of flexibility and local decision making, and to be able to benefit directly from their, hopefully, over performance. But if we start centralizing activities, whether that's for sourcing a product, pricing a product, disposal, preparation, central customer centers for handling online inquiries and potentially online sales, then all of that is contrary to that sort of delegation of responsibility to the sites. And so that's potentially going to cause some issues, and it's one where you've got to question whether the business owner or investors or senior management are willing to embrace that, recognize it, and whether their staff are willing to go along with that as well. Is it the same staff, differently motivated and rewarded, or is it different staff?
And do you think there's a clear division of dealers that are embracing what you were talking about, those sort of 5 key trends and challenges and the risk and things like this, and those that, as you said at the start, that potentially just aren't, that they've got their head in the sand, assuming that, you know, things will be okay, things will return to normal, and, you know, Curtis is going to talk to you about the agency model next. But do you think those, you know, you've got your clear winners and losers, those that are embracing all this and making the changes and either tough, you know, tough decisions in some cases, and moving forward?
They are tough decisions, and uh, there is definitely a gap. You know, there are some where you can see that they quite clearly see the direction of travel, and who are investing heavily in order to make the change. And it doesn't mean they've got answers to all those questions, but they are managing by looking forwards at what they need to do and addressing that, um, rather than managing by looking in the rear view mirror saying, well, this is what we've always done and we've got some temporary difficulty, but when we come out the other side, then we'll get back to business as usual. Business in 2 years' time or 3 years' time or whenever the situation uh, normalizes in terms of supply will not be the same as it was back in 2019 or 2017, you know, before things started to slow down a little bit. So managing by looking in the rear view mirror is not going to work. You've got to look forwards. And, you know, yes, I see, you know, even some, you know, relatively large and, you know, historically successful groups who are either ignoring that or just can't see it.
Yeah, I heard something the other day where somebody said that it's the statement that time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining for many
Yeah.
dealers.
No, absolutely valid, and that comes back to the point about, you know, do you spend your money on a helicopter or do you spend your money on fixing the roof? And um, the problem is that dealers can be kidding themselves because of the profits they're making at the moment, that they're running a great business,
Hmm.
you know, but they're not. Um, I say they're not. Some are not, and the problem with things like, and I know it's extreme, but the problem with something like the US approach to auctioning off a transporter load of cars is that's absolutely outside of any of the normal business processes. So if you make a, you know, great chunk of money out of that, it says you ran a good auction process, but it doesn't help you in the slightest when you're back to having, you know, dealer inventory on your books that you need to get the best deal that you can for. So the normal business processes have, you know, been parked for a while, and you have no idea whether the people that you've hired in the last year or two, for example, are actually any good.
Yes.
So, you know, for example, you have no idea whether your processes actually work or not. If you make a process improvement, you know, we don't know how that works, and that, you know, really takes us into the into the agency space, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, that was nicely teed up, Steve. So, but yeah, turning to agency, and you recently talked about the growth of multi-branding, which you acknowledge has been with us for a long time, especially in smaller towns where add-on brands make a lot of sense. We've seen that with the emergence of MG. We saw it with Mitsubishi and to some extent with SsangYong. But that multi-branding, that covers some of the bigger sites with the related brands. We've got BMW and Mini side by side, Renault and Dacia, JLR, and now the Stellantis brands coming together, which you call the Stellantis house. So, what's your take on how agency will impact multi-branding?
Agency will put more focus on the fixed costs of the network because the manufacturers have to fund at least the brand related elements of the dealership, or of the new car side of the dealership. And that is going to encourage them to think differently about how they can reduce that cost. It's a significant part of the total network operating costs is coming from the facilities. And if you're negotiating the prices centrally or setting the prices centrally, then it follows that you perhaps got more flexibility to treat the agent as being sort of the order taker rather than somewhere where the customer is genuinely shopping around and making choices and making decisions. And that will is encouraging them to think more about multi-branding. Mercedes have already indicated, in the UK dealer discussions that they're open to multi-branding. And when you look at the size of the Mercedes facilities and the number of the Mercedes facilities, then either you need to cut the number down significantly, or you need to reduce the square meters per site. And one way that you can reduce the effective square meters per site is by multi-branding. So that's at the heart of it, but that's not exclusively a function of agency, because the networks are too big, the facilities are too big, the standards are too high relative to the real customer needs. So whether you talk about agency or you talk about modifying the franchise system, then getting cost out is important, and multi-branding is one way to do that.
And staying with agency, I mean, we recently interviewed Robert Forrester, boss of Virtue Motors, and he said he's got no qualms about agency, and he'll introduce it with Cupra and Mercedes, saying he already does it with, obviously, as you and I know, parts departments run under an agency model in many ways, and leasing. And what do you see as the main argument for and against agents, especially in the UK? I mean, you just touched on a couple of points there. I mean, Robert alluded that he would welcome it. He's quite happy, but also he's quite happy that he's comfortable with the long lead times and shortage of supply at the minute as well.
Yeah, I don't think we want to have a shortage of supply. We want to have the right level of supply, and that is, perhaps when normal market conditions return, in the sense of manufacturers have the flexibility to decide how many to make, as opposed to making absolutely everything they can and it's still not enough, then agency is a way of forcing the discipline on the manufacturers to operate in a more disciplined fashion. And so to me, that's probably the number one reason. It clearly helps with omnichannel. It helps if you've got consistent pricing across the network, across the online and offline, the transparency of the data on the customer journey, so the customer experience is much better, and you can focus on positive aspects of the sale rather than the negative ones of trying to find some happy medium between what the customer thinks he's going to get because of what he's seen from CarWow or some other source, and what the MSRP is and what the dealer's initially asking. So we think it's better for the customer experience, but I think the main thing is it forces the manufacturer, because they are responsible for the inventory, because if they don't manage the pricing well, they're going to end up with either lower revenue per unit or higher inventories than planned, all backing up, and all the challenges of disposing of that in an orderly way. It will force them to be more disciplined than they have been in the past.
And I mean, we touched on it before we sort of started chatting, but we know that Mercedes have talked about, obviously, and you mentioned it just before, about the shrinkage of the network. Mercedes have said that their network could shrink by as much as 10% in the global market. talking about exiting retail themselves with the sale of some of their Mercedes retail sites. And, we suspect this is all in the preparation for the move to agency. And even over the weekend, I think there's been muted, obviously, from BMW Mini and the timings that Mini will be moving towards agency. But you also hear where other manufacturers are sort of saying they will not be going to agency. And do you think this is down to strategy, network, funding, cash? What do you think will happen here?
I think it will vary by brand. If you went forward 10 or 15 years, will we have seen everyone switch to agency, or everyone's back on franchise? I wouldn't like to speculate on that. I think it will depend an awful lot on the success of agency as to what happens. But if you were sat in a manufacturer, then the key things to sort of consider are really how well you think you can actually manage supply against real demand, how strong the brand is, so that people will choose to buy your product at whatever the price is at that point, as opposed to being influenced by the fact they can still do a deal on a competitive brand, and whether you've got some meaningful plan and you think your customers will value having a direct relationship with the manufacturer as well as the relationship with the dealer as agent. So not all brands will do it. Some can't afford to do it because their balance sheets aren't strong enough to carry the inventory, and the previous investments have been so high that the effect of them taking on brand related investment as part of an agency agreement would be detrimental to them, the moment the dealers are carrying that historical legacy. So it will vary brand by brand, but if you've got a strong brand, strong customer following, the balance sheet is strong enough to take a little bit of ebb and flow, your manufacturing capability is flexible enough to take a bit of ebb and flow, then I think it makes sense.
And Steve, in last weekend's show, we talked about Motonovo Finance's comments on the likely impact of agency on independent dealers, who, after all, are already finding themselves competing against some strong franchise used car brands. And I'm really thinking about the likes of Pendragon, Virtue, Peter Vardy, Inchcape, Arnold Clark. There's many more with strong used car brandings. And also the emergence of the online disruptors. Some that we've already talked about earlier in this recording. What's your view on how agency could actually impact independence, and should they be concerned by agency?
I certainly think they should be aware of it. I mean, the impact is going to be relatively modest, and they will have plenty of lead time to anticipate when it will affect them. But the manufacturers who adopt agency are most likely to use finance as the way to support the pricing of the vehicles. So they're not going to have TV advertisements running, like EasyJet or Ryanair saying, great sale this weekend, all cars £50. So they're not going to do that. They're going to put it into the finance, and therefore the cars will remain effectively under their control when they come back. A large proportion of those will be financed by the manufacturer captive, and their first option will be to sell them through the dealer network, whether that's done on a normal trade sale retail basis, or that in turn also goes under agency. We'll see what happens. At the moment they seem to be quite wary about getting deeper into used cars, but they will want their network to take those cars as far as possible. And
Yeah,
so,
no, sorry.
so I think that the supply of used cars to for the independents is going to become tighter. The volume of cars that are going into fleets on deep discounts should reduce if the manufacturer wants to make agency a success. And so when you then go down the line, then those independents are going to be fishing in a smaller pool. And as you say, the franchise dealers are being much more effective anyway with building up their used car business, whether it's manufacturer source stock or stock from fleets or going out doing a we buy any car type operation. So I think life will get harder for the independents.
And as you said at the beginning, the key to this is really the lead time, because at the moment there's a reasonably long lead time. We know it's coming. We know it's coming for certain brands, and independents have that window, don't they, to actually work out what their response is going to be and how they will compete with potentially stronger used car offerings from franchise dealers, who will be concentrating more on used cars than ever before.
Yeah, I think that if it takes, let's say, a couple of years to go through a negotiation implementation process, and then you've got an ownership cycle for the vehicles, then in the very worst case, you've got a couple of years notice that things like pre-reg is likely to decrease on that brand, or a bit longer if you're talking about stuff going into daily rental. Longer still if it's going onto a private lease or business lease. So they do have that lead time, and they need to then sort of think, okay, so supply is going to be a bit more limited in Mercedes from 2023 onwards. Mercedes have also recently made their comments about becoming a luxury brand and dropping the smaller market, so the opportunities around sort of discounted A class, B class, and so on is going to reduce. But there may still be some opportunities because the manufacturers still have this challenge about what they do to try and balance off the ideally flat production schedules of the plants and their supply base, with variable customer demand. And as I said earlier, they can accept some ebb and flow in terms of inventory levels, and they can influence that a little bit with the pricing that they're setting. But there will probably be times when they have more cars than the market demands, and they're willing to support, and they need to find some safety valves. So they need to find some way out of that. And it is possible that independent brokers and so on will still have some opportunity to capitalize on that, as long as they can convince the manufacturer that they're not going to just spin them straight out into the market, competing against the manufacturer's own new car offering. So, I think they'll have to adapt. I'm not sure that it necessarily means it's a death sentence.
Yeah, and I think, it was quite interesting you made the point there about targets and things like that. And Robert, on the interview with him, basically said that, whatever I'm earning, if it's £250 per unit, there'd be a point potentially where the manufacturer needs to move some product and they might offer me £1,000 a unit. It's incentivising us as a dealer to move some product in the same way as it does today. So it doesn't, even under the agency model, he believes that there is still this world where initiatives and incentivized to target the market will still be there when product is available. So it's quite interesting on that one. And I mean, just moving on to finally in terms of the used car prices, and we know we've seen a decline in sort of the last 3 months, not as much in the last one at 0.7% down from cap HPI from May going into June. But obviously we know that there's this, the challenges in terms of the consumer confidence around the conflict in Ukraine and the obvious one around cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in. But what's your view on how these factors will pan out and will be more impact on the new and used franchise independent markets over the coming months? What's your view on that at the minute? Big question.
Yeah, and they have this saying that if you ask 3 economists for their view on the economy, you're going to get 3 different answers. So, I'm not an economist, but I think the state of the economy is absolutely disastrous. I think it's really, really difficult to call, but I think a lot of people will be seriously hurt by the cost of living crisis. It's not going to go away. 400 quid bung on your utilities bill is not going to make any material difference to many households. But cars remain important to people, and one of the advantages that we have in the UK market is that so much of the retail business is on finance, and it is on fixed terms, at which point the customer needs to make some sort of decision. So that will help to cushion the blow, I guess. The customers will be forced either to buy a new car or to refinance a car that's coming off a PCH effectively as a used car. So there'll still be business to be done, and the challenge will be making that affordable when interest rates are going up, and personal budgets are under pressure. So I think that the volume fall will not be as extreme here as it might be in going back to Italy, for example, a market like Italy, where people tend to hold on to their cars for longer and the finance penetration is lower. But I think we should be prepared for those tough times, and I think it comes back to the point about what you do with the windfall that you've had from the last year or two, and the answer is don't go out and spend it on a yacht or a plane. It's invest it in the business, make the business as robust as possible, and as always, keep an eye on the trends and make sure you're not caught with your trousers down with a load of overpriced stock.
It's a bit like we said earlier, that time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. And I think something else that came out from the US, very much US, but saying that looking into the perfect storm, you actually need a hurricane predictor at the minute with what's potentially on the horizon. So there's a lot going on.
No, I think that's right. I think put the roof on and keep the tarpaulin over the top as well, just in case.
Well, look, Steve, many thanks for your time and for sharing your views. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we have covered a lot of ground, a lot of the key trends impacting car retailers right now, and certainly over the coming months. And do come back again next month. In the meantime, enjoy your bank holiday weekend. I suspect you'll be leafing through brochures on super yachts and private jets. I'll be repairing my shed roof.
No, I'm afraid that I was told by a couple of friends who did have yachts that the 2 days that you enjoy your ownership of a yacht, the day it's delivered and the day you manage to sell it. So.
In between is a very costly exercise. Yeah, it is. Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, thanks, Steve. As always, like you said, we could chat about the industry and what's happening in the industry for hours, because there's certainly a hell of a lot going on at the minute, isn't there? So, I mean, thanks for coming back on. As always, it's a pleasure. Very insightful and very thought-provoking, if nothing else. So, I mean, that's it for now. So you've been listening to the weekly Motor Trade Radio podcast powered by eBay Motors Group. We hope you've enjoyed this special episode, and many thanks for listening. We'll be back as normal next weekend with the big car retail headlines. Until then, it's good from me and Curtis.